Moore, Oklahoma, a small suburb outside of the state capital of Oklahoma City. To those outside of the weather community, the city of Moore, Oklahoma may just seem like an ordinary suburb of a major metropolitan city. However, to those who are interested in weather, Moore, Oklahoma is known for one reason and one reason alone. Moore, Oklahoma is one of, if not the most unlucky town when it comes to being hit by tornadoes. Since 1998, Moore, Oklahoma has been hit by 9 separate tornadoes, with 4 of those ending up being violent tornadoes. Over the next 2 videos, I will be taking a look at the 2 most infamous tornado outbreaks that included a tornado that hit the city of Moore, Oklahoma. The first tornado outbreak is the most infamous, and it happened in early May 1999. From May 2nd through the 8th, a tornado outbreak sequence tore through the central and eastern portions of the United States, with the majority of the activity occurring on May 3rd through the 4th. Throughout the outbreak sequence, multiple strong to violent tornadoes occurred, with 4 F4 tornadoes and 1 F5 tornado that lives in infamy. The Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado is one of the most infamous tornadoes in world history, because it holds the record for the strongest wind speed ever observed from a tornado at approximately 301 miles per hour. The legacy and importance the Moore F5 tornado has to tornado history is massive, and the outbreak itself is one of the most significant outbreaks to ever be observed in the United States, even outside of the Moore tornado itself. So today, I am going to take a deep dive into the May 2nd through the 8th tornado outbreak sequence of 1999. Going over the outbreak as a whole with the primary focus on the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado. I'll be covering the state of the 1999 tornado season thus far, the synopsis of the tornado outbreak sequence, the event itself, the aftermath, and the historical significance of the event. Welcome to Nature's Fury. 1999 was already a very active and unusual year regarding tornado activity before May 2nd. From January 21st through the 23rd, the largest tornado outbreak occurred in the month of January, with 123 tornadoes touching down in the span of 3 days, including 1 F4 tornado and a separate F3 tornado that struck Little Rock, Arkansas. In April, an outbreak occurred from the 2nd through the 3rd of the month, including an F4 tornado in Louisiana, and then from the 8th through the 9th, a widespread tornado outbreak occurred where 3 F4 tornadoes touched down across the country. But until early May, tornado activity seemed to die down a bit. But of course, come early May, a widespread tornado outbreak sequence was about to occur in the central and eastern portions of the United States and portions of eastern Canada. A tornado outbreak sequence that would include one of the most infamous tornadoes in history. But real quick, the majority of people who like these videos are not subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy what I create, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and tells me I'm doing something right. Anyways, back to the May 1999 tornado outbreak sequence. In early May 1999, a strong upper-level trough moved from the southwestern portions of the United States and moved into the central and southern plains. The trough dug to the south and east and then began to move further north from the 4th and into the 5th. On the surface, a series of low-pressure systems were over the Great Plains, all connected by surface fronts. Ahead of the cold fronts was a dry line that was positioned over far western Oklahoma. Over the southeastern United States, a large high-pressure system allowed for southerly flow into the Great Plains, allowing for warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico to travel to the north. Come the 4th and into the 5th, the frontal systems merged into a surface cyclone moving across the country, with strong winds at the lower levels of the atmosphere, allowing for severe weather across the southern United States as the frontal system moved through. Already, the ingredients for a potential severe weather event was in place, but the finer details of what the environment was like further cemented concerns of what was possible on May 3rd into the 4th. Winds at the 850 millibar level across much of Oklahoma and Kansas were in excess of 35 knots, with some areas seeing winds in excess of 45 knots. Winds at the 500 millibar level across much of the Central Plains ranged from 55 to 70 knots. Cape was in abundance across the Central Plains. In Oklahoma specifically, Cape values ranged from 2,000 to over 3,000 joules per kilogram across central Oklahoma. In some specific areas, by the time the supercells had formed, CAPE values reached nearly 6,000 joules per kilogram. In Kansas, CAPE ranged from 1,000 to 2,500 joules per kilogram. Long, looped hodographs were also present across the Central Plains states, suggesting supercell thunderstorms were the primary threat. Temperatures and dew points only added to the unstable environment in place that day, with temperatures across the plains being in the mid to upper 70s, and dew points in the 60s, which indicated that there would be enough moisture for storms to fire. On the 4th, the main threat was in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. Winds at both the 500 and 850 millibar heights were impressive, and supportive of severe weather, with temperatures in the 70s and 60s, with dew points in the 60s. CAPE, on the other hand, was not as prevalent across the area, with CAPE across much of the area when the tornadoes occurred being around 1,000 joules per kilogram across the region. The hodographs were somewhat curved, but not as impressive as the day prior. There was an excess of CAPE that was present across portions of Texas and Louisiana. However, the CAPE was observed after most of the tornadoes on the 4th dissipated. Synoptically, the days following had a similar trend, with somewhat curved hodographs, strong wind shear, warm temperatures, humid dew points, but CAPE values being near non-existent for where the significant tornadoes occurred. From what was described, the outbreak should have been easy to predict from a forecasting perspective, since the morning observations painted a clear picture of what the environment was like on May 3rd across Oklahoma and Kansas. Contrary to what some say, the forecast for what was expected that day across the Central Plains was truly not known until after the storms had already initiated. In the early morning hours of the 3rd, forecasters in Oklahoma knew that there was a threat for severe weather across Oklahoma and southern Kansas that day. However, to what extent and how significant the event was expected to be was unknown. Forecasters at the Storm Prediction Center specifically underestimated the atmospheric conditions that were expected on the 3rd early on. The reason as to why they were underestimated was because the models that the SPC used were not cooperating with the environment at all. How inaccurate of a picture were the models painting? Well, the first outlook issued across Oklahoma and Kansas was a slight risk. So what were the models getting wrong? The issues surrounding global models were noticed as early as 4 a.m. Central Daylight Time that morning. Doppler radar and wind profile data in the western United States indicated a 90-knot streak of elevated jet stream winds along the California-Nevada border, moving towards the plains. Weather balloon soundings from the evening of the 2nd that were sent out by NWS offices in the western United States and numerical computer model data failed to detect the strong winds within the elevated jet stream. The dry line was also diffused, with the surface winds being both ahead and behind the boundary moving into the region from a southerly direction. Meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center began to recalculate model data during the morning to account for the stronger winds caused by the jet streak, with the new data acknowledging that severe thunderstorms would occur in the Central Plains, but the models disagreed on the area of highest risk for severe weather. Computer model discrepancies that were seen on May 3rd are not seen as often today, but given that computer models in 1999 weren't the best, and the first notable major success in forecasting weather events with computer model data was with the 1993 storm of the century, discrepancies were an issue from time to time. Models were not the best, and led to issues that were seen on May 3rd. By 7 a.m., CAPE values began exceeding 4,000 joules per kilogram across some areas in the plains. Meanwhile, models were still unable to come up with a consensus on where the highest risk was expected to be. Given the observations that were present in the early morning hours, the Storm Prediction Center issued a moderate risk for portions of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas at 11:15 a.m. Observations indicated that there was sufficient shear for a few strong or violent tornadic supercells, given the abundant low-level moisture and high instability. By the early afternoon, meteorologists at both the SPC and at NWS Norman realized that something major was going to happen, and began relying solely on observational data from weather radar, satellite, and balloon soundings, as computer models continued to not cooperate regarding where the worst severe weather would be. An unscheduled balloon sounding by NWS Norman at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time indicated the environment was extremely volatile. Winds were strong, and a capping inversion that was over the plains was weakening across North Texas and western Oklahoma. Shortly before 4 p.m., the Storm Prediction Center had finally gathered enough data to determine that there was a high likelihood of a major severe weather outbreak occurring within the next few hours. With the confidence in mind, the Storm Prediction Center issued a high risk for severe thunderstorms across south-central Kansas, the majority of the state of Oklahoma, and 2/3 of North Texas. At 4:30 p.m., a tornado watch was issued for western and central Oklahoma until 10 p.m. However, even as the Storm Prediction Center outlook went out, the storms had already initiated across North Texas and western Oklahoma. In southwestern Oklahoma, a supercell thunderstorm began developing in Tillman County, and was promptly given a severe thunderstorm warning. The storm itself quickly began to show supercell characteristics and tornadic circulation. The cell was promptly tornado warned. The supercell produced multiple tornadoes, including an F3 tornado to the west of Chickasha, which had an accompanying satellite tornado. However, at 6:23 p.m. Central Daylight Time, the supercell produced its most infamous tornado, and the most infamous tornado of the entire outbreak. At 6:23 p.m. Central Daylight Time, a tornado touched down to the southwest of the community of Amber, Oklahoma, traveling to the northeast parallel to Interstate 44. As it crossed Oklahoma State Highway 92, the tornado rapidly intensified, attaining F4 strength 4 miles to the east-northeast of Amber, Oklahoma, varying in size between 1/4 and 1 mile wide. The damage was consistent with an F4 rating for roughly 6.5 miles before it reached the town of Bridge Creek. It was at Bridge Creek where the tornado attained F5 strength, utterly decimating anything in its path. Any and all homes in the path of the tornado were swept clean off of their foundations. Remaining debris was granulated into small bits and pieces. Trees and shrubs were debarked. Vehicles were thrown hundreds of yards from where they once stood, and excessive ground scour was observed, including instances where 1 inch of asphalt was stripped from the ground. While in Bridge Creek, a Doppler on wheels measured recorded winds of 301 miles per hour, with a margin of error of 20 miles per hour within the tornado, roughly 105 feet in the air. The wind speeds measured by the Dow would go down in history, as the winds observed from the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado were, and still are, the fastest winds ever observed on this planet. The tornado continued moving to the northeast, briefly weakening to F4 intensity before intensifying once more to an F5 tornado as it neared the Grady-McLean County line, where a car was thrown roughly 1/4 of a mile in the air and a well-anchored home was slabbed. The tornado widened to its widest point of over a mile wide at 1,760 yards, as it crossed the South Canadian River, quickly becoming rain-wrapped as it traveled into the southern Oklahoma City limits. The tornado was already known to be a major threat, due to the insane wind speeds that were recorded and the imagery of the tornado itself, recorded by local storm chasers and by local news channels such as K4TV. However, the tornado was on a direct trajectory to go through the most populated area of the state of Oklahoma, the inner Oklahoma City metro area, home to nearly 1 million residents. Given that a tornado of such intensity was about to ram into the most densely populated area of the state of Oklahoma, warning the general populace was extremely vital, and it had to be done in a way to establish how extremely dangerous the situation at hand was. It was then when NWS Norman began to draft a new special warning that had never been seen before. A warning drafted by NWS meteorologist David Andra in order to paint the picture that a rare and deadly tornado was imminent in the metro area. The warning in question would be the first ever tornado emergency ever issued in recorded history. Shortly after the tornado emergency was issued, a particularly dangerous situation tornado watch was issued until the early morning on the 4th. The tornado moved into McLean County at F4 intensity, killing a woman who was blown out from under an overpass. At 7:10 p.m., a satellite tornado touched down to the north of Newcastle and was rated F0. The town of Newcastle was mostly unscathed, but now the tornado was heading straight for Moore, Oklahoma. As the tornado moved into Cleveland County, NWS Norman activated emergency procedures. A town hall meeting in Moore was postponed as the tornado was on the way there. Baseball games in Oklahoma City were suspended, and the stadiums were evacuated to shelter. Flights were grounded, and airports were evacuated. The tornado briefly weakened as it entered the southern side of Oklahoma City, but then quickly reattained F4 status as it moved directly into the city of Moore, reaching F5 intensity once more. Home after home was destroyed. Business after business was destroyed. Nearly everything in its path throughout the city of Moore was flattened by the wrath of the tornado. Damage of the city ranged from F4 to F5, and many people were now left with only their lives. The tornado briefly weakened as it left Moore, but intensified to F4 intensity as it moved into Oklahoma County and the southeastern portions of Oklahoma City. Numerous industrial buildings were leveled. Railroad cars were thrown hundreds of feet across the air. The tornado moved into Dell City, damaging and destroying hundreds of homes with many sustaining F3 to F4 damage. The tornado damaged several buildings at the Tinker Air Force Base, then crossed into Midwest City, destroying one building at the Boeing complex. The tornado continued to produce F3 to F4 damage, with numerous businesses and homes being completely destroyed, with some areas being considered to have potential F5 damage. The tornado then diminished rapidly, weakening to F0 to F1 strength as it crossed Reno Avenue before dissipating 3 blocks north of Reno, south of the Midwest City-Oklahoma City line. The Bridge Creek Moore tornado traveled a total of 38 miles over the course of 85 minutes, with peak winds of 301 miles per hour, give or take 20 miles per hour. The tornado caused $1 billion in damages, injured 583, and killed 36 with 5 indirect deaths. At 7:13 p.m., a tornado touched down to the north of Wellington, Kansas, downing several power poles and destroying mobile homes, sheds, and barns. The tornado continued to move to the north-northeast, and was already wide, with a path width ranging from 1/4 mile to 1/2 mile wide. The tornado traveled into Sedgwick County at 7:30 p.m., and quickly became violent as it moved into Hayesville at 7:35 p.m. A subdivision southwest of the South Seneca South 87th Street intersection was destroyed. The business district was heavily damaged or destroyed. The worst of the damage from this tornado was in Hayesville. However, the major concern was the fact that the tornado was going straight into Wichita. Thankfully, the tornado weakened tremendously as it moved through Wichita, producing F0 to F1 damage in the city before dissipating at 7:55 p.m. The Hayesville F4 tornado traveled a total of 24 miles with a peak width of 1/2 mile wide. The tornado caused roughly $140 million in damages, injured 150, and killed 6. At 9:10 p.m., a tornado touched down to the southwest of Dover, Oklahoma, and tracked directly into the town, causing extensive damage. F4 damage was observed in the town, with numerous homes and businesses being destroyed. Approximately 1/3 of structures in the town were damaged or destroyed. A steel reinforced concrete building only had a few walls remaining. Large vehicles were torn apart, mobile home frames were wrapped around tree trunks, and trees lost all their branches. As the tornado left Dover, the tornado produced minimal damage because the damage was confined to trees, telephone poles, farm equipment, and outbuildings. The tornado continued to travel through open fields before lifting at 8:38 p.m. The tornado traveled a total of 15 miles over the course of 28 minutes, with a peak width of 1/2 mile. The tornado caused $2.5 million in damages, injured 11, and killed 1. At 9:25 p.m., a powerful tornado touched down 3 miles to the southwest of Cimarron City, Oklahoma. The tornado moved through the area, destroying multiple buildings and producing F4 damage to the southeast of Crescent. The tornado slowly moved to the northeast, hitting the community of Abel, where 1 was killed and 6 were injured, and moving straight for the town of Mulhall, just to the north of Guthrie. The town of Mulhall was severely damaged, with approximately 60 to 70% of the homes in the town being damaged or destroyed. The primary water source of the town, the water tower, was destroyed. The Mulhall Orlando Elementary School also succumbed to the raw power of the tornado. While the tornado was crossing into Mulhall, a DAO documented the largest observed core flow circulation with a distance of 1,600 meters between peak velocities on either side of the tornado. The structure of the tornado was recorded by the DAO and was a complex multi-vortex tornado, with several vortices containing winds of up to 260 miles per hour rotating around the tornado. The tornado continued to produce major damage as it left Mulhall, with cars being flipped on I-35. Major structural damage was observed in the Boonesboro Addition, a mobile home park located along State Highway 86, and 3 homes suffered major damage on US 64. The tornado lifted to the east of Perry, Oklahoma at 10:45 p.m. Less than an hour later, a separate supercell produced an F3 tornado that touched down to the south of Crescent, Oklahoma, which tracked nearly parallel to the Mulhall F4's track, with the damage caused by the tornado being nearly indistinguishable from the damage caused by the other F4 tornado. The Mulhall F4 tornado traveled a total of 39 miles with a peak width of a mile wide. The tornado caused roughly $10 million in damages, injured 26, and killed 2. At 10:10 p.m., a significant tornado touched down 3 miles to the north-northeast of Sparks, Oklahoma. The tornado caused scattered F0 to F1 damage as it tracked through Davenport, parallel to I-44 and State Highway 66. Then, the tornado hit Stroud, Oklahoma, where the tornado intensified to its peak intensity as an F3 tornado. Most of the town suffered F2 damage, with the trucking terminal of the Sigma Food Distribution Warehouse being destroyed. The Stroud Municipal Hospital suffered significant roof damage, with significant water damage being observed in the building afterwards. The worst damage occurred at Tanger Outlet Mall, with almost all the stores suffering severe roof damage. 7 storefronts were destroyed, and the exterior walls of the Levi's store collapsed inward. Thankfully, the mall was evacuated ahead of the tornado, likely saving many lives. The tornado continued to move to the northeast, mostly over open fields before dissipating at roughly 10:50 p.m., 1 mile south of Stroud Lake. The Stroud F3 tornado traveled a total of 15 miles with a peak width of 750 yards. The tornado caused roughly $60 million in damages, injured 13, with no deaths being attributed to the tornado. While the majority of the focus on the coverage of the event is directed at Bridge Creek and more, the outbreak from May 3rd through the 4th and the sequence as a whole produced numerous tornadoes, with a large number of those tornadoes being significant. A long-track F3 tornado that touched down to the north of El Reno, Oklahoma and traveled to the northeast, and another F3 tornado that touched down to the south of Atona and moved across mostly open fields. However, the event was far from over, as the outbreak sequence extended into the next few days. On the 4th, a number of tornadoes touched down across Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. The environment was suitable for tornadoes to form, with high wind shear, especially at the lower levels of the atmosphere, warm temperatures, and high dew points. The issue was that Cape was not as high as the day prior, and the majority of the tornadoes that formed that day formed before Cape reached above 2,000 joules per kilogram across Texas and Louisiana. Regardless, multiple significant tornadoes touched down across the areas I just mentioned, including a long-track F3 tornado from Oklahoma and into Arkansas, lifting before reaching Fayetteville, a long-track F3 tornado from northeast Texas that traveled into Arkansas, and a short-lived F3 tornado in Missouri. On the 5th, environmental conditions showed strong wind shear across the Mississippi Valley area, but the Cape was very low. However, a violent F4 tornado occurred on May 5th, which struck the town of Linden, Tennessee. The tornado was short-lived, lasting for only 8 minutes and traveling only 6 miles. But the tornado damaged or destroyed numerous structures in the small town, killing 3, injuring 6, and causing $295,000 in damages. Of course, the now inland cyclonic system traveled off to the northeast, and now the primary focus was the recovery effort. And what was left was the aftermath of one of the most prolific tornado outbreak sequences observed across the plains in years. In order to leave no stone unturned, the areas that were affected by the outbreak outside of the Bridge Creek Moore tornado will be covered first. All across the states of Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and elsewhere, devastation was widespread and evident with the multiple tornadoes that touched down across the United States. Specifically, with the tornadoes that caused at least F3 damage. In Hayesville, Kansas, the small town outside of Wichita was destroyed. Houses were ripped into bits and pieces of debris that were scattered about. The small town was changed forever that May 3rd, with the town being left unrecognizable, with debris littering neighborhoods and streets. And yet, it could have been far, far, far worse. The tornado traveled into the Wichita area directly, with the storm weakening to F0 to F1 intensity as it struck, nothing short of a complete miracle. If the tornado kept its intensity as it did when it struck Hayesville, a large humanitarian disaster would have erupted in Kansas. 6 deaths were attributed to the Hayesville F4 tornado. In Dover, Oklahoma, a third of the structures in the town were damaged or destroyed. A steel-reinforced structure was destroyed with only a few walls remaining intact. 1 death was attributed to the Dover tornado. The Mulhall F4 tornado destroyed large portions of the town, with 60 to 70% of the 130 homes in the town being damaged or destroyed. Absolute devastation was observed in the town that was now leveled by the F4 twister. 2 deaths were attributed to the Mulhall F4 tornado. The aftermath in Stroud, Oklahoma was significant. While no deaths were observed in the town, the economic impact to the town that was severely damaged by the F3 tornado that ran through the town was massive. The economic losses in Stroud were horrific. Approximately 800 jobs were lost in the community due to the damage at the Sigma Distribution Warehouse and Tanger Outlet Mall. Neither were rebuilt. The town's economic state would not recover much later after the tornado had passed. The F3 El Reno tornado lifted a 3,000-pound oil storage tank and moved it half a mile away from where it was originally located. Tornadoes in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana on the 4th caused major damage to numerous structures, destroyed numerous mobile homes, and caused fatalities with those who were in the path of the tornadoes. Of course, the community of Linden, Tennessee was caught off guard by the surprise F4 tornado that rocked the small community. Houses were reduced to their foundations, trees were debarked, and the small community was left in shambles as the tornado had caused extensive damage to the town. In total, 3 people died from the Linden F4, but the tornado outbreak's primary focus was on the path length of one specific tornado in particular. While the other tornadoes mentioned up to this point regarding the aftermath were significant, they were overshadowed by the strongest tornado in terms of measured wind speeds ever recorded on planet Earth. A tornado that left any and all communities in its wake with almost nothing. As the Moore tornado dissipated, very few knew how widespread the devastation was that night. However, the images that came out from the towns and cities hit the day after, as the sun rose across Oklahoma, spoke for themselves. Structure after structure, home after home, were just gone. Destroyed and torn to shreds of debris scattered about. The tornado was violent to begin with, reaching F4 strength shortly after touching down. But the damage was limited to a few areas as it traveled across mostly rural areas of Oklahoma. But the story changed as soon as it hit Bridge Creek. Homes were completely swept away. Only the concrete foundations were left behind. those foundations being the only indicators of what once stood. Remaining structural debris from some of the homes were finally granulated into small fragments, and trees and shrubs were completely debarked. Few of the homes were bolted to their foundations. Approximately 200 houses and mobile homes were destroyed, and hundreds of other structures were severely damaged. Ground scouring was present. Vehicles were thrown hundreds of yards from where they once stood, and about 1 inch of asphalt was ripped from one road. 12 people died in Bridge Creek, 9 of those in mobile homes. All of the fatalities and most of the injuries in Bridge Creek were confined to the Willow Lake and Southern Hills Additions and Bridge Creek Estates areas. Most of the homes there were mobile homes. Outside of Bridge Creek, a house with anchor bolts was reduced to a bare slab, and people who were hiding underneath overpasses, thinking it was the safest place to be in a tornado, were killed. But now the tornado had traveled into more. First was the Country Place Estates neighborhood, where 50 homes were destroyed, and one was swept clean off its foundation. Numerous vehicles throughout the city were thrown about like toys. Then the tornado hit the Greenbrier Eastlake Estates, reducing rows of homes to rubble. In one part of the neighborhood, 4 adjacent homes were reduced to slabs. A 2-story apartment building was mostly flattened at the Emerald Springs Apartments. The Westmore High School sustained heavy damage, as people were sheltering in place inside as an award ceremony was being held at the time the tornado occurred. The tornado continued to move through more, flattening structure after structure that stood in the tornado's path. The damage in Oklahoma City was violent. Several industrial buildings were flattened. A freight railroad car weighing 36,000 pounds was thrown 3/4 of a mile away. Multiple homes were destroyed. In Del City, hundreds of homes were destroyed by the tornado. In Midwest City, the business district was severely damaged, with numerous buildings being destroyed. The damage from thenceforth until it lifted was minimal, with F0 to F1 damage being observed in the rest of Midwest City. The damage observed from the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado is among the worst observed in the state of Oklahoma and in general. Thousands of people were now left homeless, many with only the clothes on their backs. The Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado was responsible for 36 deaths, with 5 indirect deaths and 583 injuries. The damages sustained from the tornado totaled at over $1 billion, becoming the costliest tornado in U.S. history until the 2011 Tuscaloosa Birmingham EF4, then the Joplin EF5. And yet, despite all the death and destruction from the tornado, the communities that were struck came together. Throughout the communities struck, American flags waved up from underneath the rubble. People were collecting the pieces, finding pieces of their family's legacy. People were going out to check on each other and help recover as a whole. The strong sense of community is evident in almost every natural disaster, but in Moore and Bridge Creek and all over the state of Oklahoma and those affected by the tornadoes, it was true and awe-inspiring. But of course, there were numerous miracles that happened in the aftermath of the tornado, none as famous as what Deputy Sheriff Robert Jolly found at the remnants of a lone house that was struck by the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado. Jolly was out searching for survivors as he stumbled upon the house that once belonged to Amy Crago. Amy and her 10-month-old daughter, Aaliyah, took shelter in an enclosed closet in their home when the tornado struck. When Amy came to, she was injured and tried to find her daughter and any other family nearby. She searched for help and was transported to the hospital with help from a nearby motorist as she had a cut on her head. Deputy Jolly arrived at the house searching for any semblance of life. It was as he was searching when he found what looked like to be a small doll. However, what he found instead was a small baby covered in mud, crying as she was put on the police cruiser.
Hang on, baby. Hang on.
The small baby, Aaliyah, only had a few bruises and recovered. She's been interviewed multiple times now and is fascinated with tornadoes. The event regarding Aaliyah was nothing short of a miracle. Many of those who survived were now ready to rebuild, and many areas, at least in Moore, did rebuild in some spots. The tornado's legacy in Bridge Creek, Moore, Oklahoma City, Del City, and Midwest City lasts to this day. But the tornado's legacy, already historic due to its wind speeds, was about to become even more important, as the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado was the final straw regarding the Fujita scale, becoming the final F5 tornado in the United States and the second major tornado that was cited as to why the Fujita scale needed to be updated. When it comes to the Fujita scale, its flaws had already been known as far back as the 1970s, but it was during the late 1990s when the need for an improved scale was desperately needed. Just a year prior, Dr. Long Fawn and Emil Simu released a report titled The Fujita Tornado Intensity Scale, a critique based on observations of the Gerald tornado of May 27, 1997. The report in question was the first report that used a previous tornado to establish the need to update the Fujita scale. I covered this back when I covered Gerald last year, so I'm gonna briefly rehash what I said there. The findings of the report noted that the houses in the Double Creek Estates subdivision were poorly constructed, as evidenced by nails being used to anchor down homes instead of anchor bolts, among other construction flaws, and that the minimum winds needed to cause the destruction in the Gerald subdivision correlated with an F3 tornado using engineering calculations. Since I have to spell this out for people considering the comments section on the Gerald video, no, Dr. Fawn is not arguing that the tornado was not an F5 and didn't have winds of over 260 miles per hour. In fact, quite the opposite. But what he was arguing was that with the scale in its current state, because it doesn't take into account construction quality, there was a potential issue regarding tornadoes being overrated in terms of their intensity, and that building codes would suffer as a result. With the potential issues regarding building codes in mind, Dr. Fawn advocated for a new scale that would take into account construction quality when rating tornadoes alongside making the wind speed estimates more realistic. His conclusions regarding the surprising amount of houses that were not up to code, meaning the tornado ratings became extremely difficult to accurately assign, was reinforced with the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado. While yes, the tornado's F5 rating stands because there were houses that were completely swept that had anchor bolts, and thanks to Dow data registering the winds being 301 miles per hour, if we didn't have that information, then there would be serious problems regarding the tornado's rating. I am going to go ahead and spell it out for that one person who's going to take what I'm saying the wrong way. I'm not saying that it wasn't an F5 tornado, or didn't have winds that correlated with an F5 tornado. I'm saying that without the information that we have regarding the few well-constructed buildings and the Dow data, it would be nearly impossible to tell how strong the tornado likely was. Two reports specifically discovered that the majority of frame homes destroyed by the tornado were below building code standards. The first was a series of preliminary damage surveys conducted by a group of structural engineers from Texas Tech University, who found that many of the frame homes destroyed were constructed below federal building codes, and in some instances, some structural deficiencies violated federal codes. The team was led by meteorological researcher Charles Doswell, and engineer and meteorologist Tim Marshall. Some of the findings they made were that nails attached to a plywood roof deck in one home wasn't properly anchored to the rafters. Several homes in rural areas that were swept nearly 300 feet did not have anchor bolts. Some homes were attached to their foundations by tapered cut nails. Several homes were destroyed before being hit by the core of the tornado, and it goes on and on. The main conclusion made was that the majority of the homes that were hit by the tornado were only built to withstand F2 tornadoes at the most, in an area that experiences violent tornadoes a lot. The FEMA Building Performance Assessment Team report on the May 3rd outbreak further cemented the issues regarding the construction quality of homes in Bridge Creek and Moore. The report noted that much of the damage that resulted from the winds by the tornado often produced forces on buildings not designed to withstand such forces, due to construction shortcuts and a poor selection of materials used during construction. So, TLDR, the tornado's strength, if it weren't for the Dow data and the few homes that had proper anchoring, the tornado's intensity could have been lower than what it actually was. Based on the findings from the construction quality of the structures impacted by the 1997 Gerald F5 and the 1999 Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado, it didn't take long before meteorologists and engineers came together to discuss how to fix the scale. And over the next few years, the beginning of the enhanced Fujita scale's creation began. The Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado's importance to the Fujita scale cannot be understated, and is often attributed as the main tornado to advocate for a new scale, and it definitely was. Likely because it went into a major urban area and caused over $1 billion in damages. The proper rating of tornadoes, especially given how bad the original scale was important now more than ever, since with a more realistic scale, homes would be built with newer and more sufficient building codes that were realistic. But that said and done, let's go ahead and get this over with. From May 2nd through the 8th, a tornado outbreak sequence, where most of the activity occurred from the 2nd through the 6th, rocked the Central Plains and southern United States. An outbreak that would be in the record books for numerous reasons. Most of those reasons being attributed to the strongest tornado regarding wind speeds in recorded history. The Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado was like no other. Its wind speeds of 301 miles per hour, with a margin of error of 20 miles per hour. Very few tornadoes come close to the wind speeds observed from the Bridge Creek Moore tornado. The devastation it brought to the communities in its path was some of the worst observed in recent memory, and the worst observed in the state of Oklahoma. Not to mention its importance regarding the development of the enhanced Fujita scale. And yet, the outbreak was so much more than the Bridge Creek Moore F5 tornado. From the Hayesville, Kansas F4, a tornado that miraculously weakened drastically before going through Wichita, to the Dover F4 tornado that destroyed the small town, to the Mohall F4, which similarly left the town with almost nothing, to the Stroud F3, which left the town crippled regarding its economy, to the numerous other significant tornadoes throughout the event. While the damage from those tornadoes are not as catastrophic as what was observed in Moore and Bridge Creek, the damage was still horrific to witness. Many people lost everything to these tornadoes, and yet, all across the areas hit, they came together to try and rebuild to the best of their ability. Nearly a quarter of a century later, the scars from the 1999 May tornado outbreak sequence still remains across Oklahoma and Kansas specifically, alongside numerous other states. It's an outbreak sequence that the locals will not forget, and it's an outbreak sequence that I will not forget anytime soon. I'm going ahead and going straight to Moore 2013. I'm running way behind schedule, and Moore 2003 is part of a massive outbreak sequence that needs to be pushed back until next year, more likely than not. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Rishi, Alice, and Broker, Oklahoma Tornadoes on Twitter for linking me to some tornado damage photos for the Mohall F4 tornado and the Stroud F3 tornado, Celtic White for the character stills that I use, Zinel, Cyanide Blue, and Krakelek for letting me use their music, and everyone for watching. It means a lot. Special thanks to those subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member. Those being Ace Cooper, Maxwell Looney, Montpelier, Tanner Lepper, and That Dude at the Alfie's Army tier, Heldrake Zero at the Alf Jr. tier, and Basilius of Stupidonia, Ed Taylor, Epics, Hannah Stormer, Jay Cario, King Shisha, Neon Binary, Sav770, Sandra Dunn West, Talkboy, and Worm Off the String at the Alf Mini tier. If you want to have access to full uncut interviews and my scripts, alongside other things in the future, consider subscribing to the Patreon or becoming a member. It helps me financially and will allow me to do in-person interviews in the future, hopefully. Anyways, that covers everything. If you enjoy what I do, consider liking, subscribing to the channel, commenting your thoughts, and sharing it around, all that jazz. I'm Alferia, you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you all soon.